Hi friends, it's video time again. This week, a little bit of a change of scenery. We are in the bedroom because this is where the better light is in the morning. My flat faces east-west, which is just a bit of a nightmare, but hey, we're here, we're lit, we're looking good. And in this video I want to talk about some of the books that have completely altered the way I look at the world or how I live my life. I was thinking about them this week and about how these aren't necessarily books that I would put on my favourites of all time, or for one of them even books that I enjoyed that much. However, these four, so this is the fiction edition. I am going to do a separate video on non-fiction books that have completely changed how I look at the world, but I think it's more expected for books that changed your life to be non-fiction books. But these books have hugely contributed to who I am as a person. And I'm not talking about, oh, they made me think about something and then I forgot about it. I'm talking about huge systemic change. I'm talking swallowed the blue pill, ate the forbidden fruit, opened Pandora's box kind of change. The first book on this list is, you can't really read this very well, but it is Under the Skin by Michelle Faber. As you can see, it has been made into a feature film with Scarlett Johansson. I have never watched the movie, so I don't know what that's like. However, I took a module in, it was about 2015 when I was at uni, I took a module on post-humanism / post-colonialism in literature. Now, very briefly, post-humanism is kind of moving beyond our traditional idea of what constitutes the human being. So one part of it is themes of maybe moving beyond our human bodies, which could be ideas like being able to download your consciousness or augmenting ourselves, turning ourselves into cyborgs, things like this. It can also be moving beyond what life forms are allowed to be defined as human. So widening that concept to include animals or even the landscape as full characters. So this was on the wider reading list for that module. We never actually studied it, but I saw it had post-humanist themes, and so when I saw it in the charity shop a couple of years after that, I picked it up. Now, the basic premise of this story is, what if aliens treated us the way that we treat animals? Now, that doesn't sound particularly groundbreaking, but the way that it's done really hit home to me. So I would strap in because this book is uncomfortable. The trigger warnings are dysmorphia, graphic sexual assault, cannibalism, and captivity. It has been a few years since I read it now, so a lot of the details have faded, but there is one particular scene that when I read it really sucker punched me, and it stuck with me through all the years since. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put spoilers across the bottom of the screen while I talk about the scene itself and the events of the book, and then when I take that away I will just be talking about my reaction to it. So if you don't want to know anything, you can skip forward to when it no longer says spoilers on the screen. So the main character of the book, Isserley, she is an alien of low class with a traumatic background, and she has been surgically altered to look like their best estimate of a human. She passes as a human. She drives around Scotland picking up lone male hitchhikers. She then tries to find out from them, do they have family? She was looking at whether they have muscles, and if they meet her criteria, she drugs them, kidnaps them, and takes them back to this, what is basically a farm. There, they are castrated like we do to farm animals that we don't intend to breed. Their tongues are cut out and they are fattened up before being slaughtered and sold back to the home world as a delicacy for the rich. Now, at one point in the story, this kind of, I forget exactly what he is, he's some kind of inspector, but he comes to view the farm, to tour the farm, and he has sympathies with the livestock. He wants to know that they're being taken care of, and there's one scene where he's viewing these men and one of them tries to write the word mercy in the dirt because obviously he can't speak, and he says to Isserley, he says, "What is that? I didn't know they had language." And she says, "Well, it depends on what you classify as language." She then has an internal monologue about how humans can't really be considered human because they have no concept of X, Y, and Z, and these are like made up words. She doesn't explain what these mean. These are obviously meant to refer to things in the alien culture that they consider inherent in their humanity, for want of a better word. And this really highlights how ridiculous it is for humans to say that other animals don't deserve the same rights that we afford to human beings because they lack things like language or higher reasoning. These are things that we have placed importance on and have used to separate ourselves, to say that, oh, we can do what we want to them. And it's only by adding another layer to the food chain above us that we can really get that perspective, be put in our place, and see how ridiculous that reasoning is. So basically, the book thematizes who gets to decide what constitutes humanity and who gets to decide that another life form's suffering is acceptable to fuel its lifestyle. This was the book that really got me thinking about my diet, what I eat, and the lives that our so-called livestock must lead. I went vegetarian very shortly after reading this, and I went fully vegan not long after that. Now, unfortunately, I am a very emotional eater. I have really like peaks and troughs when it comes to emotions, and when I'm down, I struggle very much with sticking to a strict diet. It was a whole thing. I ended up going back to counselling. I thought I was giving myself an eating disorder. These days I am meat-free unless I'm really not doing well, and mostly dairy-free. So long as I'm eating at home, I'm dairy-free. If I'm ordering out, it gets a bit more difficult. But the ideal is, like the end goal is to eventually sustainably remove all animal products from my diet. The key word being sustainable, I think, or one thing that I've learned in more recent years is in order to do more, I need to expect less of myself. You know, I can jump in and say, I'm going to be vegan, but actually that was very difficult for me, and I ended up right back at the beginning and I wasn't even vegetarian anymore. So we're trying to build it up slowly. But when people try to tell me that it's natural for animals to eat other animals, I think, well, okay, fine. You go out with a bow and arrow and hunt a wild animal like your ancestors did and give it the chance to kill you, as much chance as you have to kill it. Because there is absolutely nothing natural, in my opinion, with us using our prefrontal cortexes, opposable thumbs, and the industrial technology that they have given us in order to abuse, mutilate, and murder other living creatures. It just... no. Now, I do realise that I have got on my soapbox a bit about this. This is not a preachy video of me telling you that you should be vegan. There are other ways to contribute to the welfare of animals, and everyone has their own opinions. However, I would challenge you to read this and see if it makes you think. Now, not to say that this was the only reason that I went down that path. I think it would have happened eventually. However, this was a big push for me to start thinking about an issue that I maybe hadn't thought about before. So the same year that I took the posthumanism module, I also took a module called Climate Change and the Novel. Spoilers for what this next book is about. We studied 3 or 4 novels which were about climate change or thematised climate change. I only remember this one. Now, you might argue that that's because it's the one that I wrote my term paper on, but I think it was also the one that had the most impact. So the novel is Flight Behaviour by Barbara Kingsolver, and I read this, it's nearly 10 years ago now that I read it, so again, a lot of the details have faded. So the basic plot centres around this woman, Delorobea Turnbow. She lives with her family, she's married, she has kids in quite extreme poverty in Tennessee in the United States, and she feels very trapped in her marriage and in her life. She's never had any opportunities or education or anything like this, and she has decided she's going to cheat on her husband. So she goes off to a secluded area in the woods on her way to go and meet this man, and on the way she discovers just hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of monarch butterflies all wintering on the trees in this forest. Like, they're absolutely covered in it. And she becomes a bit of an internet celebrity for discovering this, because the monarchs are completely out of their normal habitat. Normally they would fly south to Mexico for the winter, and people are wondering, like, oh, why are they here? So again, I'll put spoilers across the screen. You can skip forward if you don't want to know any more. But what happens then is a climate researcher, a university professor called Ovid Byron, arrives on the scene, and he's researching the phenomenon and basically saying that they should be worried. This isn't just a pretty phenomenon, that the monarchs aren't likely to survive spending the winter in Tennessee when they normally spend it in Mexico. He also raises the issue of climate change and the fact that he thinks the monarch butterflies have changed their behaviour due to climate change. But the butterflies are essentially climate refugees, and Della Robbia becomes a bit of an assistant to him, and through that she learns about the climate crisis and how we're all ignoring it and the disaster that we're heading towards. And also, he is married, so get your minds out of the gutter, it does not go in that direction. So I am probably going to get on my soapbox again about this one. I'm not even going to apologise. This is something that I feel strongly about. So one scene that really stuck with me is Della Robbia returns to the butterflies at one point, and there is a climate campaigner there, and he's asking people if they can commit to making some changes in their lives in order to reduce their carbon footprint. So he starts going through the list with her, and it's things like choosing to fly less, not leaving your computer on standby overnight, only using one car. And she's just looking at him saying, like, they are so poor that these aren't choices. They are already making these choices. They don't fly. They can't afford more than one car. They can't afford a computer to leave it on standby overnight. Now, this scene really highlighted to me the sort of misplaced direction of a lot of climate campaigning. It's really focused on all these little tiny things that, oh, you can do as an individual, which I'm not saying are not important. However, you've got multinational corporations like oil companies and Coca-Cola that are lobbying governments with millions of pounds, millions of dollars, who are pushing out millions and millions of single-use plastic bottles every year. These are the places where small changes can make a big difference. If I recycle or if I don't recycle, in the grand scheme of things, it does very little. Now, obviously, I try to recycle. I wash my clothes at 30 degrees. I try to turn things off when I'm not using them to save energy. But that is all a drop in the ocean. The people with the most resources, the companies with the most resources, are the ones that should be taking the most action. The other aspect that stuck with me was how the book thematizes framing. So framing, specifically when you talk about media framing, is how a story is presented to the audience. So you'll know it yourself. Two different news outlets that have two different ideological points of view will present the same story to their viewers in two completely different ways. They'll frame it as either positive or negative depending on how it plays into their ideological narrative. And we know this happens, but we are more sensitive to it when the narrative does not fit with our own. If we are left-wing and a left-wing news outlet spins a story to us in a certain way, we don't really question it. And it's the same with the right. It happens left, it happens right, it happens in the middle. However, the book isn't saying that that is necessarily a bad thing, because how something is presented to you, the story behind it, really has an impact on how you process that information, how you empathise with it, and what action you might take. So there's a point in the novel where Ovid Byron, the researcher, he completely loses it with a reporter who questions whether climate change even exists. And I can relate so hard to that, but also the result of him shouting and swearing at her on camera is that it makes the news and the story gets a lot more coverage. And I think the point that Barbara Kingsolver is trying to make is that how the message is presented is so important for how much attention it gets and how much people will connect to it, that scientists are too focused on data, which data is obviously important, but once we've ascertained what the data is telling us, then how do we translate that into a message that people are actually going to connect with and act on? And I think this novel itself is an example of her trying to package that message and frame it in a way that people can connect with it on a human level. This obviously isn't a new thing that authors do, going back to things like Dickens and the Victorian social problem novel that was trying to highlight the plight of the poor. If you go back to Uncle Tom's Cabin with the plight of slaves, that really helped to connect people emotionally to the abolitionist movement and also to help convince them that slavery was incongruent with Christianity. So there were actually two main factors in me wanting to change my diet, the main one being animal welfare, but the secondary one being climate change and the impact that large-scale industrial farming has on habitat destruction and the climate crisis. Again, I've had to expect less of myself in order to do more. I used to get so angry with my neighbours when I saw them not recycling properly, and I used to rage at my colleagues when I worked in an office about leaving the heaters and the lights on overnight. Or there was one guy, he always had the heater and the fan on at the same time. Like, why do you need both? But I've kind of had to accept that I can't control other people's behaviour, that getting angry at people does not make them want to change, and that all I can really control is what I do. And also that while it's important that I try to change my behaviour, that the whole world is not resting on my shoulders, that the impact that I can make is limited when you have multinational corporations who are the drivers of pollution and the climate crisis. Okay, soapbox over. That is it. There are no more political issues to be covered in this video. We front-loaded them. It's done now. You can relax. I'm not going to preach at you anymore. The third book is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is completely different from the other two, because rather than sensitizing me to kind of ethical or political issues, this was one that has just shaped my entire taste in books and movies and games, and through that has steered the direction of my life through the people that I connect to and the friends that I made. So I suppose you could maybe argue that it was my dad that did that. My dad was an OG Tolkien fan. He was playing D&D and reading The Lord of the Rings in the 70s when he was a teenager. And then, I don't even know, so this is actually a Rothes Hall's library edition, which I'm going to apologise to you right now because this was due back in April 1997 and you're not getting it back at this point. But I don't even know who got this out of the library. It might have been my sister, but we found it at my mum's house. We took it to my dad's house when we went to visit and he started reading it to me and my brother. And that's a really warm childhood memory for me. You know, my dad would do all the voices when he read you a story. So he read us the story of Bilbo and the dwarves and Gollum, the mountain, the dragon, and it was just amazing to me. He did the voices for the trolls, he did the swallowing noise that Gollum makes in his throat. But I have never been patient, and I was 7 years old and I could read at this point, so I read ahead. But I still very much enjoyed the moments on the weekends when we got the next chapter read to us. I remember him telling me that there was a sequel called Lord of the Rings. I found the copy at my granny's house and attempted to go straight into reading it. But no matter how precocious I was when it came to books, 7 years old is too young for The Lord of the Rings. But this was the book that sparked my fantasy addiction, I think it's fair to call it. I read a piece by Terry Pratchett a few years ago, I don't even remember how long ago now, and I can't find it online, which is frustrating because I know I'm going to be misquoting it. However, it talked about his own fantasy addiction and how he got into fantasy, and there was one line that said something like, "When I could finally walk past a book with a picture of the dragon on the cover without my palms sweating." And this resonated so hard with my own experience of getting into fantasy when I was younger, because after The Hobbit, it was anything with a dragon, with witches, with wizards, with swords. If it had swords, I wanted it. the Redwall series. I read so many books in the Redwall series. I finally did read Lord of the Rings when I was about 11 years old. My dad took us to see all the films when they first came out. That was another bonding experience. When we would visit him on the weekends and Saturday evenings when we'd all sit together, one of the main things that we would talk about a lot was fantasy, and specifically we would talk about Middle-earth and the history of Middle-earth, and he would tell us things from the Silmarillion, which I'd never read. We were always bothering him to let us play Dungeons and Dragons, and he said, oh, you know, you'll get bored of it. We eventually got him to set us up a game and we got bored of it. But when I became a teenager, the people that I connected to more were the people who were into the same kinds of books and the same kinds of video games, that were into fantasy and swords and sorcery and all that stuff. It's been my goal to write a book since I was 5, and my goal to write a fantasy novel since I read The Hobbit. Now, my love of reading is not the same as my love of fantasy. I did love reading outside of this. I love different types of books. I loved The Famous Five when I was younger. However, I think it's a valid question of whether I would have ended up with a literature degree and be talking about books on YouTube if it wasn't for me reading The Hobbit. Who knows? So the last book on my list is 20-something, The Quarter-Life Crisis of Jack Lancaster by Ian Hollingsworth. That's a mouthful of a title. Now, this is kind of a joke one, but there is a story behind it. Now, when I read this for the first and only time 13 years ago, I did not think it was a book that I would ever be putting on a list of books that changed my life. It was maybe a 3-star at best. It wasn't great, it wasn't bad, it was just middle of the road. I read this book when I was 21 years old, just turned 21 years old, which was 13 years ago, as I said, so you can do the math. I do not remember a single thing that happens in it, except for the titular main character is having the titular quarter-life crisis, and his friend suggests to him that he start a journal, and he does. So I was having a crisis of my own at this point. I had just dropped out of university the first time that I went to study law. I dropped out halfway through my 3rd year. I had, let's not call it a drug problem, but that sounds really bad, but it was definitely drug problem adjacent. But I get to talk about it now because it was a long time ago and I don't have that problem anymore. I was working a crappy job, waiting tables in a hotel, which, by the way, shout out to anyone who does or has worked in a hotel. You guys are the unsung heroes. You are not paid enough, you are not respected enough, and you do not get enough sleep. I had no job security because my contract was 0 hours, so they could just stop giving me work if they wanted to, which they did for a period of about 2 months. I was living in a crappy flat with crappy flatmates, I was in loads of debt, and I just had no idea where my life was going. Fun fact, a few months after I read this book, it got even worse when I got fired from my crappy job and fell out with my crappy flatmates. Not the same crappy flatmates, different crappy flatmates had moved at this point. And I had to go back home and be drunk and unemployed in my granny's spare bedroom. So 21 was a good year. Now, bear in mind that this was 2011. This was way before the benefits of journaling were being shouted about on every social media post and YouTube video about self-care and productivity. I had no idea that YouTube could be used for anything except viral videos. This was the era of Chocolate Rain and Farmville and bragging about how many friends you had on Facebook. Keeping a diary, as I thought of it, was something for teenage girls to write about the boys that they fancied. You know, you got those little ones with the locks on them, which, now that I'm talking about it, is there a gender connotation between the words diary and journal? And why do we talk about keeping a journal and not a diary? That's interesting. The point is that there was no one in my social media circles who was keeping a journal, talking about journaling, none of that. It all seemed just a bit juvenile and stupid, and it would probably be a bit embarrassing for someone my age to keep a diary. But I read this book and I thought, my life sucks, why not? Now, my first journal entry was from the 16th of May 2011. Yikes. Don't worry, I won't read you the whole thing. But just to give you an idea, So my new idea, just as a point of interest, is to keep a diary. Just finished reading 20-something, The Quarter-Life Crisis of Jack Lancaster, about a guy who keeps a diary. The book was good, although it didn't exactly blow my mind. So I thought, why not? I want to write, and seeing as I'm short on inspiration at the moment, why not write about the mundane? And my life is nothing if not mundane. Then I complain a bit about things and finish with, the main item on the agenda is to find another job. The first step in climbing out of this hole that I've dug for myself. So, instead of going out to look for one, I'm going to smoke, eat cheesecake and play Pokemon on my DS. That'll work. I also quit smoking since then. Don't smoke, kids. It's not cool. The amazing thing though, is that I am still keeping a journal to this day. I wanted to have them all in my hands and show you, but when I dug them all out of the cupboards, there are too many. So I will pop some footage in here of all my journals dating back for the last 13 years. I haven't necessarily kept it consistently. To start with, I did about a year, then I had a couple of years break, then I think I did another year, then 6 months break, and then it's kind of become more regular as I've gone on. At the moment I am in a period where I am doing it less often. The habit fluctuates. However, I always come back to it and I am wanting to build it back up again because I have never found anything that is so effective for helping me plan and manage my emotions, work through my thoughts, figure out what's actually going on with me, motivate myself, just keep a record of my life as well. When it comes to the end of the year and you want to set goals and you're thinking about who was I at the beginning of this year and what progress have I made, if you have a journal, it's all there. I don't really go back and read the older ones anymore. I used to do it. I used to lean heavy into that nostalgia and it wasn't particularly good for me. I used to look back at times in my life when I was very unhappy and feel a lot of nostalgia for them. I still don't really know why because I knew I was unhappy, but I still like to have them. I like to keep them. I like knowing that all my memories and experiences are stored in there and this is just a physical representation of all the progress that I've made in 13 years. So although I don't remember a thing about this book, although it didn't really wow me, it didn't really leave much of an impression, I have to say that this book completely changed my life because it is what got me to start journaling. Maybe I would never have started a journal if it wasn't for this. Although, let's be honest, I probably would have started one eventually. One of my many therapists would have suggested it. But let's give it the credit, So there we go. 4 fiction books that completely changed my outlook on life. And I would be really interested to know if you have any similar books. Is there a book that you read and it just made you think about something in a completely different way, or made you start doing something or stop doing something that you've continued to this day? I would love to hear about it. I would love to read those books. Leave me them in the comments. But if you made it to the end, thank you very much. If you would like to stick around, if you would like to subscribe, I'll leave you and the subscribe button to get better acquainted, and hopefully I will see you in the next video. Bye!